You're listening to Consulting Logistics, presented by Aborn & Company. I'm your host, Kyle MacNaught. Thanks for checking us out. As the world observed the UN's World Day Against Trafficking in Persons on July 30th, it is critical to recognize that many global supply chains are powered by human trafficking and forced labor. BSI, the business improvement company, is calling on organizations to assess how they can mitigate the risk of human trafficking in the supply chain and can take actionable steps to combat the use of forced labor. In this episode, I'm going to talk with Fred Waelter, principal consultant for sustainable supply chains at BSI. In this conversation, we're going to discuss how human trafficking works in the supply chain, some of the latest data and trends, and then mitigating the risk. So, I'm going to bring in Fred. Fred, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing good. It's a super fascinating conversation we're about to have, especially reading up on the stuff. And I mean, it's eye-opening when you hear supply chain and stuff like supply chain and human trafficking, especially as we go global. So, for the audience, tell them a little bit about yourself before we kind of get into everything. What do you do at BSI?
So, just to explain maybe who BSI is, it's a company that was founded in 1901, and it was the first national standards body in the world. So it started off with standards for sections of tramways in London, interestingly enough. And today we take standards of best practice and turn them into excellence. So basically looking at things like ISO 9000, ISO 14001, those are both standards that I think people have heard of, and BSI helped to write those standards. And where I work inside of BSI is called BSI EH&3S Consulting. EH&3S stands for Environmental Health and Safety, Security, and Sustainability. And so the little area in which I work is sustainable supply chains. I'm a principal consultant, and I'm based here in St. Louis, Missouri. I started as a social auditor in 2003 in China. One of the languages I speak is Chinese. And I was conducting social audits, basically going to factories to see if they have child labor, forced labor, if they beat the workers, exploit them otherwise. I relocated to Vietnam. I was there for a year, and then I lived in the UK before coming back to the US. And most of the last 15 years, what I've been focusing on, instead of just focusing on actual audits in the field, has been helping clients to answer some of the questions they have about supply chain management from a social responsibility and security standpoint. So like, should I have a code of conduct for the suppliers with whom I work? Or should I be checking my factories through audits? What should I do with the information I get back? How do I help them improve? So that's kind of my little world at BSI.
Wow. I mean, I didn't know, you speak Chinese and everything. That's crazy. Sorry, you caught me by all that stuff. But that's kind of focus. I mean, you clearly live a fascinating life. You clearly are connected. You're clearly more global in kind of your world. So let's talk a little bit about something that's going to be difficult to talk about, but something that I think is extremely important to talk about, which is human trafficking. Mm-hmm. Now, help my audience, learn about this. How does it work? How do global supply chains play a part in human trafficking and forced labor?
Yeah, so there's actually always an imbalance of labor in the market. So in any given place, you'll have a situation in which there is a need for work, for workers to do the work, and there's not enough workers to do it. So you might have a situation like in Japan where there's a lot of migrants working there, and that's because the population growth rate is negative. So they just need the people. In other locations, so in Taiwan and Malaysia, it's that the local population may not be so excited about manufacturing jobs. They might be a little bit harder than what people want to do as a line of work. And so they will rely on migrant labor to come in and fill that gap. And an unscrupulous but pretty effective way to keep a constant stream of labor coming into the country is to essentially build up a system that forces labor. And so you might ask yourself sort of like, if I'm exploited, then why would I want to do this job? I don't really understand what forced labor is. And there's a lot of ways that people are forced to do work. So I can talk a little bit about something called the ILO indicators of forced labor. There was a report that the ILO put together, which basically summarized what are some indicators of forced labor. Things like abuse of vulnerability of being a migrant, or being in a certain kind of a situation, deception, restriction of movement, retention of identity cards, so people holding onto your passport or your driver's license or other documentation, withholding your wages or debt bondage, and then also abusive working and living conditions. And with that goes excessive overtime, of course. So if I put it in an example from my real experience that maybe will help to illustrate what does this look like, you've got migrants that are coming from a country. So I'm going to just use an example of an investigation that I did in Malaysia. There were workers coming in from Vietnam. The workers were paying between $4,000 and $10,000 a head to get a job in Malaysia. The legal limit in Vietnam is actually at $4,000, so most people are paying over that. And after paying all that money, they get to Malaysia and then they find out, wait a minute, the job for which I signed up is not the job that I'm doing. So it's a bait and switch. And in our world, we call that contract substitution. So effectively, you get a contract in your home country and people tell you this is going to be your job. And then you end up in the other country. And once you're already there, you find out, wait, this isn't my job. I'm not making as much money as I thought I was going to be making. I don't get to work overtime as much as I thought I could. My take home pay is too little. I'm living in a terrible dormitory. You don't know any of that stuff before you get to the country. And so that's kind of that bait and switch. And then you've got all this money hanging over your head because you've paid thousands and thousands of dollars to a recruiter. You might still be getting that withheld from your wages, paid back to the agency on a monthly basis. And you're stuck there because you can't really speak the local language. You don't have any recourse to local legal support. And so you're just sort of there doing your job, trying to pay off the debt that you already owe. And that really ticks all those boxes for the indicators of forced labor that I mentioned earlier. And so that's really how it manifests itself in the supply chain. And that's a terrible example, but in reality, it's pretty common.
Yeah. Uh, I mean, selfishly, I think of it at like when we kind of started talking about this, and I read a little bit, so I was more aware, but I never thought of it like that. I mean, that it seems to almost hit a little closer, like someone
Right.
could really emphasize with that type of thing of like being in a place where you weren't thinking you thought you were doing a different job, but this sounds like honestly the worst thing ever.
It is,
Uh,
yeah.
and I guess, I mean, I know it's been around for a while. Like, I'm not
Right.
crazy to think human trafficking and forced labor has been around for a while, but how much of this crisis is a result of just this connected world? I mean, we talk global supply chains, but it really happens because someone wants to have one day shipping on Amazon, more or
hmm
less, and people, the thing has changed. Is this how much of this crisis is being affected by kind of this consumer shift we're seeing?
So, like it or not, I think nowadays, due to global supply chains, we're all touched by forced labor. My wife and I both worked in the social compliance space for years, and we absolutely cringe when we go to the mall. Well, or when we used to go to the mall before COVID, I guess. But we'd be looking around trying to make an informed decision about what do we want to buy, where we know, okay, this isn't going to be made in dodgy conditions. This isn't going to be made by forced labor. And the fact is, as a consumer, you just don't know. There's no master list of countries that you should avoid, and your purchase actually is pretty important because it supports livelihoods of people that are, just doing an honest living and everything is okay. So you don't want to say, well, I'm not going to buy anything, and that's also not realistic, right? So forced labor could be in any product that you want to buy, food, apparel, electronics, toys, you name it. And the thing that you can do as an informed consumer is to kind of see what are brands and retailers doing. On their websites, they'll typically have like modern slavery statements, or they'll have other information about how they monitor their supply chain. And so you'll want to kind of keep a look at that. I think there's good news here in the US in terms of promulgating legislation to stomp out forced labor. So there was the 1930 Tariff Act, which goes way back, but it used to have something in it that said, we can't buy forced labor products unless we really need them. And then if we really need them, then we can. It's called the consumptive demand loophole. Obama closed that in the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act in 2015. And in 2017, there was another law, which I think is really relevant for everybody who's listening in. It's called CATSA, Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. Basically, what that did is it has an FAQ that's closed the loop, and it's advising companies to look at indicators of forced labor and connecting those with penalties. And another good thing for consumers here in North America is that the USMCA, according to the new legislation that's going to be required for Canada and Mexico, there will also have to be laws that are forbidding the imports of forced labor. So I think that's one way that consumers can kind of be reassured. It's not to say that it'll be caught all the time, but to say that we're not touched by it is simply not true. I mean, anything that you could have in your house, anything you could imagine could have been touched by forced labor.
What about for a company? I mean, other than like, yeah, there's legislation and stuff, but how difficult is it for organizations to really catch this? I mean, it sounds like if the company, I mean, these people like in Malaysia, they're not going to say, oh, by the way, we're doing this type of thing. How hard is it to catch it? Because I feel like I recently read an article about like a major U.S. company that found they had forced labor. Like what do they have to do to even catch this happening?
So, so I have to say it's not simple or super straightforward. But it's like the lottery; you can't win if you don't play. So you can't find forced labor if you don't look. The first step is gathering information, maybe through an SAQ, a self-assessment questionnaire. And I think looking at things like migrants, are there migrants working in a factory? That's often a subject that there's going to be some risk associated with it. And then auditing on the ground or remotely is important. The most important data point really is to talk to the employees themselves. And that's something we do every day in the social auditing world. An auditor needs to know the laws of the sending and the receiving countries, and they need to speak the language of the workers. So at BSI, we do that through remote interviews where you have a native speaker in the home country that speaks the language of the worker that you're interviewing, and then you can do it through a video conference. And it's very good rapport that you can build up together. And that's where you really get the good information. The worst locations, I think, in terms of forced labor that are the hardest to find, honestly, are going to be in tier two. So tier one, you know the name of the factory and their location because it's in your contractual documentation. You know exactly who they are. But then their subcontractors and their sub suppliers and their sub suppliers, it's really buried pretty deep. And honestly, programs these days don't really look at tier two just due to resource constraints. And so I would definitely advise looking at tier two in addition to that. But tier one is definitely a good starting point to look for forced labor.
Yeah, I mean, it's all the resources, right? It's how deep
Right.
can you really get with all that stuff. So BSI does a really great job at tracking this stuff, but I'm confused. How does it work? How do you measure and track this threat? Like what tools, what technology are you guys utilizing to kind of find it?
So we have something called the Supply Chain Risk Exposure Evaluation Network, which it's the abbreviation for that is SCREEN. So most of the time people just call it SCREEN. And I can tell you, I wasn't always at BSI. I worked for another company that also operates in the space. And one of the many reasons for which I joined BSI is actually this system, the screen system. It's supported by 7 full-time analysts, 14 research assistants, and then a bunch of SMEs on our advisory group. So including me and a bunch of other people. I think you might have also interviewed another person on another podcast that also supports the screen system. And the info that goes into that system are actually categorized in indices, covering forced labor, child labor, working conditions, a number of other topics. And there is a news feed also that comes up that kind of categorizes stories by this is the type of story, this is the country in which it's located, so you can search it. The thing that I think is the neatest about it is there are some heat maps, and I think everybody likes heat maps because they're a nice visual representation of what's going on. So you can literally see hotspots that appear in red based on these various things that we're looking at. And it's a great system. I think that if we didn't have those people supporting it, though, actually like putting the data into it and vetting it, it's no more than just a visualization on a screen, right? So it's actually a quite a good system.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, it's a big thing I believe in too, is how do you get technology and blend it with trusted sources and brand experts, people that people can listen to, they can trust, they know that they know what they're talking about. And it sounds like a really great system. It's got to be extremely difficult though. I mean, like you said, it's a ton of work. So let's jump into it though. Let's talk a little bit about some of the trends. Like what's the current data saying regarding trafficking existing in the supply chain? What are we seeing from kind of 2019 to 2020?
2019 and 2020 saw a lot of issues when it comes to migrants and supply chains being exploited. So in 2019, if I'm quoting some statistics, 2019 we had 42% of reported incidents being related to labor rights involving migrants, with 48% in 2020. So it's an increase. And of those incidents, 50% in 2019 and 52% in 2020 involved forced labor conditions, and that also included wage issues. And I said before that those are sort of intrinsically linked. This is hard data, but we should keep in mind it sort of confirms what we anecdotally already know. And as I also mentioned before, tier two, tier three, they're often not sexy. They're not publicized in the news. And so what's discoverable from an auditing perspective or even in the news is not going to be readily available. And I would say that, the statistics that we have in screen might be slightly understating it simply because those parts of the supply chain are just unknown.
Right. It sounds, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like a tier two is like really like a lot smaller. It's one of
Yeah,
those, like, it's not like a giant facility. It's like this one guy has 10 people that you're like, wait, what? Like
it could
that's,
be.
yeah.
It
Or
could
that
be. I
might
mean,
be,
you could have a situation with like an on-site subcontractor where you have a group of workers that work under a supervisor, and they're not technically under the company, and so they're not included in the books that people would normally audit. Or it could be just a factory down the street that takes overflow orders. Usually, it's those sites that are super dodgy because I think
all right.
people now know, if you're going to go and you're going to audit a factory, you're going to definitely go to tier one. So if they can, they'll definitely push all of those issues off into tier two because they can, right? And tier two is obviously, if you're looking at a subcontractor's relationship, the price point that they're getting for the product that they're producing has to be lower than what tier one is getting. Otherwise, the finances don't match up, right? So if you imagine you're seeing issues in tier one and tier one is bad enough, then imagine what tier two or tier three can look like. So,
So even with your stats, even with the current data, you're seeing 40, and that's saying like that's only tier one mainly. Like
right, it's going to be covering
42% of
more stuff.
recorded violations had 50% of them involving forced labor.
Yep,
Wow.
that's like that.
Wow. That's not good. Not good. And
No,
that was 2019. So 2020, let's talk a little bit about the elephant in the room that everyone's dealing with. What role does COVID play in the increase from 2020? Because that was that was just 2019, but we know 2020 already more than a little over halfway through, and we're seeing an even more increased percentage. So what is COVID doing with this? Why is this happening? What is COVID? How does it play a part?
I think that's a really good question. And I think that a lot of people that are even practitioners in our space that really know their stuff are still scratching their heads about what is COVID doing with everything. I think COVID is certainly not helping. There are a lot of migrants that are experiencing layoffs right now and unemployment. And given that, if you just look at the situation with India, I think you may have seen stories where migrants had to walk on foot because the railways were stopped, walking on foot back to their home state. A lot of them died on the way of starvation or just being exposed to the elements. Those workers were laid off because there was a massive factory shutdown across India. But that's not just the case in India. In Malaysia, there was also a movement control order, the MCO, which was in place, which stopped a lot of factories. And so what that really means is that migrants are not working. They're not making the livelihood that they were originally making. And so either domestic or international migrants might be on the lookout for new jobs that can replace the livelihood that they were making at their previous role. And beggars can't be choosers. And quite literally, people in these situations are looking for whatever is out there. And so employers know that. And given that in a lot of these countries, the situation with migrant labor is already pretty atrocious, what will happen is the factories will exploit that even further because they'll be picking up people that obviously are not able to do the job that they were doing before. And so they're willing to do whatever, and they'll pay them lower wages. And if we look at the situation I mentioned before with contract substitution, it's even worse because you were in a country, maybe you got a role that you weren't expecting, but you know what, you got used to it, it's okay. And now you don't have that role anymore. And now you're in another factory, which probably pays even lower wages. So the situation with COVID has certainly not improved things at all. In fact, it's made it a lot worse. And I think part of the other issue is that a lot of companies have stopped doing the auditing that they were doing due to COVID because auditors can't get to factories either. So what you have is a lack of visibility in the supply chain, and that certainly is not helping things either.
Yeah, I was gonna say. I mean, a lot of what we hear is just the warehouses are behind. They don't like. There's just so many issues occurring, but you're not even thinking about that human element of this stuff.
Right.
Of like, hey, we can't keep as much attention. I mean, we're just recently the whole trucker safety week. They had to push back because of COVID. So
Right.
if they can't even patrol nationwide that stuff, it makes a ton of sense that auditors and anyone trying to like keep this at bay are going to be struggling.
Yep, that's actually the case. And there are ways around that, but it still is the case that people are not able to move around like they were before. And so that means less visibility into supply chains.
But I am just I'm trying to find something positive. But like
Yeah.
I feel like wait, we're communicating over a virtual network, and like you say, a lot of times the way you kind of are working through this and doing the interviews is virtually. How and this is sort of off script, but how important does this? That's kind of start going positive. How important is the technology? Much as horrible as the technology is leading to stuff like more forced labor, how much does it help with kind of catching this stuff where we don't have the resources, but we have the technology to be able to get into some of these factories in a way that we never could before.
Yeah, so it certainly is helping. I mean, at BSI, we've really ramped up our immersive technology offering because people have just been asking over and over again. And obviously, it starts also from our large assurance business, the quality management systems audits that we do for certification. But really, if it's also including this sustainable supply chains aspect, there really is a lot that we're still able to do now, albeit remote. So just as an example, here in the United States, I'm doing a remote audit of an electronics factory in the Midwest, and I'm not going to go there in person. I'm doing the entire thing remotely using WebEx and a number of other tools. I'm able to do a walkthrough of the work floor using cell phone technology, and we're able to do worker interviews where we can select the workers from the work floor by looking at them through video on the cell phone and then having them come into a conference room where we have a video chat set up. So it's really kind of filling that gap that's there, and it's something that people really don't know is possible. As a social auditor, I would have always said before, no video of an audit or going to do an audit remotely is crazy. But if you don't have any other means to do it, it's actually a pretty good solution.
It, wow, I kind of that's fascinating because like you hear about like the privacy and stuff, but there's also other ways it kind of works, and I mean that's just a really great example, being able to walk around and sort of not be there but be able to spot people and kind of have that type of stuff. You could definitely see why it's so important in this connected world.
Hmm.
But let's also talk a little bit more. Let's talk about sort of, you kind of went into this a little bit, but what should organizations do to mitigate the risk? What steps should they be taking, other than kind of what you said? Is there some additional stuff? I mean, let's give some action items. How do you take some actionable steps to start trying to at least be on the right side and make sure that you aren't contributing to human trafficking or forced labor?
So I think there's a lot of things that companies can do, and I think to some extent, many brands and retailers have been forced by consumers to do it. So I think identifying and assessing risk in the supply chain is a very basic step. Um, that can be done, like I mentioned, again, also using technology through self-assessment questionnaires where you're asking a facility. And I know obviously people say, oh, SAQ, that's a four-letter word, believe it or not, in the sustainability space. But if it's well designed and the questions are not very obviously yes or no, where yes is great and no is terrible, you can actually get some actionable information through SAQs. I think also something to look at is the existence of migrant labor in the supply chain and really focusing on suppliers that use migrant labor. Not to say that they're bad because they use migrants. It's not the case at all. In fact, it's giving those people a livelihood. But what you can do is you can look at them as a little bit more of a space that needs attention in order to better understand what's going on with the migrant labor that's actually on site. I think a modernization of the labor recruitment process would be a godsend. It's something that's probably not going to happen anytime soon because I think there are a lot of players in the recruitment space that would prefer to keep things as they are right now. But there are some efforts out there in terms of certifications or audits of labor agents. So not just auditing the factory, but also auditing the management systems of the labor agents and really pushing it back on them to do the right thing. Um, so I think those are some examples.
What about right now? What's something that they can do? They're listening to this on a Friday morning and they're going into work. Is there something that, hey, you know what? This is one of the simple steps that you should be doing just every day, kind of something that you can do immediately. That's not a giant process change.
I think that there are a few things. So one is do something basic like establish a supplier code of conduct. Tell people in your supply chain what you expect of them and tell them that it's not okay to have forced labor and explain what forced labor is. So you could make something called the employer pays principle as part of your supply chain requirements. And basically what that means is that workers don't have to be indebted to be employed at a factory. And so we also call it the zero fees recruitment principle. So that's something that you could include in your code of conduct. And what I think people don't often think about it, and this is for anybody who's listening, if you've got a code of conduct, translate it into the language of where your factories are located so they can read it and actually understand it. You wouldn't believe the number of codes of conduct that I see are in English, and it's like, is somebody in Vietnam or in China going to be able to read this? Maybe not. Um, Mapping the supply chain is super key. I think everybody is probably wanting to map out tier one, but looking at tier two and potentially also just looking at something simple like packaging providers. Those are often falling out of scope, but they've got your label, they've got your name brand all over them. And so, looking at tier two, including packaging, um, conducting audits with a reputable provider, actually getting somebody on the ground to go to the factory, or don't use that excuse of COVID to say, well, I can't send anybody into the factories because none of the audit providers can get there. Do audits remotely, like we just talked about. Get somebody with some eyes on the ground, even though they're not physically there. And I think the last thing is remediate. I've seen so many programs where clients just get loads of data of audits back from the field, and they go, great, we've audited our whole supply chain. It's like, well, now you know how bad everything is, or where things are actually going really well. But you'll often hear people in our space bitching about auditing, and they'll say, well, auditing doesn't really solve anything. It's just, teaching people what you're going to find, and then they can better hide the problem. And I think auditing is a tool, just like anything else. If you don't audit, you can't know what the benchmark is. You can't know what's really going on at the factory today. But once you've audited, you've got to go and actually close out those findings and work with the factories to fix them. And it's shocking how many companies don't put as much emphasis on remediation and just look at the auditing piece alone. So I think those are some things that companies can do.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating because a lot of what you're saying is just typical business stuff. I mean, it's stuff you would do
Right.
for anything. You're like, this one's for human trafficking. How is
Yeah.
this the thing that you're gonna, we'll punt down the road? Like, I totally get the whole translate because I believe it or not, I actually did come from a standards organization prior to joining Aborn. So I completely get that point. A lot of people do keep it kind of very simple. The final
Yeah.
thing I want to say is to talk a little bit about the importance of awareness, because I think that's something. I mean, you hit me with the first question, right? You blew my mind. How important is it for people to be aware of what actual human trafficking looks like? It's not Taken, right? It's not how do you say his name? Liam Neeson on the phone saying my daughter's being pulled under her bed right now. It is what you explained. How important is it to be aware of this? How much do you why should people be aware? Because what's the causation? If more people are aware, what happens?
So I think it's super important. I think that on a consumer level, and so this could go for anybody who's listening in, just to know what companies are doing to make better buying decisions for yourself. So take a look at a company's website, and if they don't have any mention of ethical sourcing or supply chain monitoring, then obviously that's kind of a question mark. If they have very bare bones mention of it, it's probably because they're not doing that much. So that's just an informed consumer sort of an approach. But I think internally at brands and retailers, we often see a huge disconnect between the social compliance manager, the person who does the practitioner role of what I kind of preach, and then the entire buying organization. So the buyers are out there, they have various things on which they're measured. So are they able to source the kind of products that are needed? Is it of the quality that they need? Is the turnaround good? Is the price right? The price point right? Those things are things that buyers are usually measured upon, but they're not really aware of what's going on in the supply chain when it comes to social compliance. So often the social compliance manager will come in and go we can't use this factory because there are all these issues here. And I don't think the buyers really know what the issues are. What I've seen done successfully, and I've done more than 100 trainings for all steps of the supply chain, but whenever I focused a training on internal staff at a brand or a retailer, oftentimes it's been the aha moment that I see when the buyers and also other people that make managerial decisions that affect buying, they come in and then they see real situations on the ground, like what does this actually look like when this kind of a situation is happening? And so I can give you a real life example, and this would be an example that I would give to people that are in a buying organization.
Yeah, please do. And just a warning for anyone listening, just a quick heads up, but yeah, please let us know. Please give it an example.
So an example could be I went to Malaysia, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier. I went to a factory in Malaysia, and the reason why I'm mentioning this one is because it's from a migrant labor standpoint. This is pretty horrendous. Um, Keep in mind that I've done hundreds and hundreds of audits, and I've audited in a lot of countries around the world. I go to this site. It was tier two, so that's another indicator. Okay, maybe it's kind of untouched. This is the first time that I've ever used the word squalor in an investigation report to describe how people were living at the site. This site was making a product that has a fairly high level of technology in it, so it wasn't something that is a tchotchke that you buy at the dollar store. I mean, this is stuff that costs quite a lot of money. Yet outside the dormitory, there was burning trash. There were curfews placed on the workers, so they couldn't go out of the dormitory at night, even if they wanted to socialize. They were $5,000 to $10,000 in debt. They were sleeping more than 10 people in a room. The room was a tin roof that wasn't connected to the walls, and it was in Malaysia where it's hot as all get out. So you think about this and you go, this is real. And so what I did was I took this information that I saw during the investigation, all my observations, the photos, and I sent it back to the client. And the client showed this to the people that are part of the buying decision. They said, wait a minute, like we can't be sourcing at this factory if they don't do something about these issues. So instead of just cutting and running, they forced the factory to make reparations to the employees, to pay them back all the fees that they had been charged for recruitment. And then they also took action to look at some of the situations in the dormitory to make it so that their living situation was a little bit better. And I think that it was a case study of, oh my God, this is so shocking. But on the other hand, it's saying, you know what, if people can see the situation there, and there's no real excuse with all the technology we have now, you'd be able to see video and photos of what's going on site. If you can see that, then you're able to make an informed action decision about whether or not we want to source from this factory. Do we want to force them to improve the conditions on site? So I think that's a real life example. It definitely shocked me. I can say that for real. But I think that it's definitely not the only situation out there. We hear all the time that this is really, really common. It's just kind of poignant for me because this was something I just saw at the end of last year.
Wait, this was the end of last year? I thought
Yeah.
this, because you told me, like full disclosure, you told me a little bit about this before we even started recording. I assumed it was something kind of a while back. This is the end of last year that you
Yeah,
saw
this
this?
is this is just the end of last year. So this is not like 20 years ago. This is like today.
Jeez.
So it's still happening. I think that more and more companies are looking at zero fee recruitment. They're looking at doing more monitoring in the supply chain, but without it, if the factory is left up to do what they normally do, their cost function is miscalculated to not include in things that are important, like paying for recruitment fees or paying workers the wages that are owed to them. So without monitoring, those things would just happen on their own, and workers would be in just that situation where they're not able to escape. They can't really do anything about it. They don't know any steps of legal recourse, and they're just stuck there.
Man, it's a bad way to end the episode, but I guess let's leave it on a good note. What can a listener, what can a viewer of this episode, what can they do? How does BSI help? What can they do to kind of reach out and start to kind of get that going? What's BSI doing to help you out?
So we're doing the monitoring activities that we've been doing, like I said, but we're still doing them remotely. For the most part, in many countries, we're able to operate because COVID is not the dumpster fire that we have here in the United States right now. But there are locations where we're still doing auditing. I think what is keeping us in the consulting space at BSI extremely busy is that because people haven't been able to do the auditing, they are looking more at remediation. And so I think the positive note on which maybe we could end is that people are actually looking at how do we close out these issues. So it's like maybe they have a snapshot of time from all this on a while back. They don't want to send somebody in the field. They can't get someone in the field. Maybe they're not so hot on remote auditing. So then they can focus more on closing out those issues that have been open this whole time. And so they're starting to do things like have another look at their program. Are their buying practices influencing the situation and making it worse? Are they properly educating suppliers about their requirements? Are they checking up on them to make sure that they've closed out action items. They're really taking another look at that. And I think that's actually a really good thing. Maybe the only good thing that's coming out of COVID.
Hey, if it's a good thing coming out of COVID, that means people are trying to, again, assess their human trafficking. You can't be too mad about that happening.
No.
But yeah, Fred, thanks so much for joining me today. For the audience listening at home, what's the best way to kind of get in contact with you if they have more questions?
So they could send me an email at fred.waelter@bsigroup.com. I guess we'll post that as well. Or they can also find me on LinkedIn.
Yeah, absolutely. We can include the links and everything like that. So go in the show notes to see all this stuff. In the meantime, Fred, it was a hard talk, but thank you so much for helping inform me and the audience.
Well, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Have a great day.
You too.
And that's our show. Have a question or want to comment about human trafficking in the supply chain? Let us know. We definitely want to have a conversation about this and help raise awareness. In the meantime, subscribe and share our show. Thanks for watching Consulting Logistics. I'm Kyle MacNaught. Rock and roll.